Should the British stop tolerating intolerance? Good morning again, everyone. Ajmal Mashour, British Council of Britain. Right, there's a massive political row about this, about Michael Gove, about government agendas, about political interference, about Ofsted. If we can set that aside and talk about the general, focus on the general issue, if that's all right. It looks like there are issues. This sort of thing's been going on a while. It was a private school, but back in 2007, the King Fahd School in London had books describing Christians as apes and pigs. And that was a private school, as I say. The Olive Tree Primary School in Luton, which teaches 5 to 11-year-olds, had books which praised individuals who love death more than life in the pursuit of their religion. And now we hear about this radical preacher, some very, controversial views, being invited to lecture in this state school. Do these things trouble you?
Yes, they do, of course. We should be teaching our children universal values. We should be teaching what the true faith teaches, which is to do with respect, acceptance of others, even if you disagree with them, to be conscientious citizen, God conscious all the time. Being good to God means being good to your fellow human being.
We should teach them that in a state school.
I believe we should be teaching morals across the board.
Be God conscious?
Yes, because God conscious, in my view, makes you who you are. I believe, as a believer, that we are hardwired to believe in God. That's how I believe. Now, if somebody doesn't believe that, that's okay. I'm quite happy to respect their view. I think the problem, what we are seeing now, I have 2 kids and I don't send them to state school at the moment. We've been homeschooling them because I believe fundamentally our education system is failing our kids. But by creating this pack mentality, putting them all in one school, giving them one sort of curriculum to be taught, it creates what we call the ready meals style education program. That doesn't create or nurture the innate goodness of children. We have done that. My kids speak 4 languages fluently now.
But how and why have these objectionable ideas crept into schooling in this country?
I believe that's because what we have done is, as a government, our government has failed miserably in providing a clear framework for ethical teaching. If you look at the way our education system is divided, it's between private school, grammar school, and state school. State school is at the bottom of the pile. Private school is the top. Why should the state school be left to rot? Why shouldn't the state schools have the same funding? Why shouldn't we not invest in good schools, good teachers, and good environment for our kids to become better?
Well, let's talk about education. Let's take it away from the education debate, if I may. Maajid, Nawaz, on the subject of these views, surely schools should reflect the areas in which they are operating and the communities which they are serving. And if you have a community which is 95% Muslim, surely that should be the focus of the school. That sounds like a pretty Govian idea, doesn't it?
Well, put aside what Govian ideas are. I'm a secularist. I believe in religious neutral politics. I believe that despite a school being 98% Christian, 98% Muslim, which Parkview was, if it's a state school in a secular country such as Britain, then it mustn't be endorsing any form of religion as its official way of doing it. So, though I agree with Ajmal's critique of the education system, where I would respectfully disagree is that schools don't have any business teaching God consciousness. That's for the parents to do, and he's doing it very well with his own children. I know his family. But it's not a school's job to do that. And
so what has been going on, do you
What's
believe?
been going on is people have been mixing, and not just wider society, Muslims themselves have been mixing 2 issues, social conservatism, and it's no one's business how religiously conservative anyone else is, and that's not extremism. But when you try and impose religious conservatism on any public secular institution, the imposition of that is what's extremism, and that's what's being taken, that's what's being objected to here. No one cares, frankly. I don't care, no one else cares. If someone covers their hair, if someone grows a beard, for religious reasons, no one cares, and if they do care, they're wrong.
But it's the imposition in a secular context. Well, what about this row about this extremist who said some very, well, disobliging is not the right word, some disgusting things about, stoning people and death for apostates. He wasn't saying that in the school, though, was he? And you're a liberal, and you should. He wasn't talking about those things in the school. He was doing a general lecture on religion. So as a liberal, you should support his right to do that, shouldn't you?
Right. So
are you a liberal?
Yes, and I support the legal right for him to speak, even if I disagree with those views. Just as if he was saying racist or homophobic or any form of bigotry. If he's speaking in this way, he has a legal right to do so. That doesn't mean that I tolerate it in civil society. It means I challenge it. Just as I would challenge racism, just as I would challenge homophobia or anti-Semitism, I will challenge a Muslim who's calling for women to be stoned to death. I don't say put that person in prison. What I do say is that we must not confuse liberalism with tolerance. Any political agnostic can be tolerant of bigotry. A liberal will seek to liberalise. A liberal will say you are wrong for being racist or being homophobic.
Miriam Francois, so I see that you're pretty desperate to say something now, but just on the subject, if I may, if you'll allow me, of this particular gentleman, Shady Al-Sulaiman, who came into this school and he has these particular views, do you support the right of the school to have him there and his right to go in and talk?
I think schools should be vetting the people who speak to children much more closely than clearly they have been. But I do take issue with the idea that this reflects some sort of radicalisation because some overzealous governors are wanting to impose social conservative mores within the school. I think the problem really is to do with the fact that this government and the government before it, in fact, has allowed schools to develop a much more independent ethos. And in fact, that allows academies and free schools to give governors a much greater say in how schools are run, in the ethos, in even how the curriculum is defined to some extent. So in doing so, it is effectively saying to communities, you can define your local ethos according to your own views. But then when it doesn't like the way in which communities form their own ethos, form their own
That's what I meant by the sort of Govian principles.
It is absolutely Govian principles. And to be fair, the other issue is that this government really is playing a double speak here. It can't, on one hand, talk about the issue of cultural isolation and support faith schools. Faith schools develop all sorts of forms of cultural isolation. That isn't to say they should be promoted in any secular schools, but to suggest that's a form of extremism suggests this government is actually supporting forms of extremism in faith schools.
Which it does. Bizarrely,
I don't want to have a faith school, non-faith school debate.
I understand that, and you don't want the whole education debate. Gove, for all his ills, has continued something that's been going on for decades in Britain, and that is there's an underlying law that says every school should have an act of worship. Every school child should have an act of worship. And I think that is nonsense. I completely agree with Maajid that a secular approach to education is what...
like in France.
It is what's needed.
But
there are schools... If you go to local...
By whom is it needed? You mean that's what you want?
No, if you go to local...
There are, as it happens, quite a lot of conservative Christians in this country who object to the way...
There absolutely are, Peter.
Let Peter finish, I'll come right back to you.
Who object to the way...
Wait, let Peter make his point, and then I will come back to you.
Thank you.
In good order.
Who object to the way in which Christianity has been stripped out of the state school system, despite the fact that it is supposed to be in the system following the 1944 Education Act. It's a legal requirement, and the secularists in the education system quietly, and as far as I'm concerned, unlawfully, have removed Christianity from our schools. And we are, as a result, a spiritual desert as a country in which any kind of conservative religious opinion is constantly sneered at by people such as this gentleman as being extremist or otherwise unacceptable. Extremist is a non-word. It means nothing. It means opinion currently unfashionable. If you wish to discuss whether something is right or wrong, discuss that.
Marion struggles to say Peter Hitchens does have a point.
Yeah, well, we might
Let me come back to
disagree
Kevin.
on a few
Kevin, respond to Peter. And I want to speak to Douglas Murray. Kevin.
It doesn't surprise me that Christians say they're being marginalised or they're being not given the status that they want to have, because it's quite right, they shouldn't have that status. In Britain, forgetting about the Muslim issue, in Britain there are schools tomorrow who will open and teach their children about creationism. They will teach their children that evolution is a lie and a conspiracy. That is nonsense. And me as a taxpayer, I'm funding that. That's obnoxious.
Well, let's get back to the state schools. Let's get back to this particular issue and the alleged extremism that has been going on. Not the Trojan horse context. We don't want to conflate two issues here. But Douglas Murray, you know, 95% of children in a particular area are of the Muslim faith. You were complaining in your article in The Spectator that in one primary school music was banned. That's kind of another issue. But raffles and tombolas were banned. I mean, what do you want to do? Do you want to encourage Muslim children to gamble? What's your problem with that? It should reflect the nature of the school.
So first they came for the tombolas.
For what?
Look, the problem
gambling
going on
wrong
here,
in those communities.
The problem going on here is that we're in the middle of a debate. I mean, the nation is going through something very substantial change, and I think that what we've been discussing in recent days and what we've been discussing this morning kind of reflects this. I mean, until very recently, you know, if you said to people, and it comes back to the British values thing as well, if you said to people until very recently, what is Britain, what are British values, you'd have got a fairly clear reply along the lines of, you know, a Protestant Christian country, we have institutions of church and state and monarchy and so on, which represent the country. As one of the results of mass immigration of recent decades, there has been a substantial change in the country. All sorts of good things have come from that, and some negatives have. But one of the things that has come from it is this confusion about what it is we are. We want to be open and tolerant. We want people to be able to practice their faiths. We want people to be able to express themselves and live the lives they want to live. What we're finding it very hard to do at the moment, and I mean the French secular example has already come up, is to work out where our lines are drawn as a nation, because they're not clear at the moment.
It's impossible to draw those lines, isn't it?
It may prove impossible. It may be that we do something like the French state did and try to draw very clear lines. That's what you've heard in recent days. There's a bit of it already this morning, that, you know, there's a problem with some schools that are actually, you know, state secular schools that happen to have had...
How bad are these problems?
The problems exposed in Sir Michael Wilshaw's report are pretty serious, and there's more to come.
Really, what's so serious in the report?
I think, for instance, I mean, Wilshire himself says that these children are at risk of cultural isolation. There have been findings of children, for instance, being taught in assembly to chant anti-Christian chants and so on. This is very unpleasant sectarian stuff.
Did you know that none of the kids were spoken to?
But
did you know that none of the pupils in that school were spoken to during that so-called investigation?
And there are many all-white schools
the teachers were not spoken to either. You come to Stamford Hill, where I live, we're not far away from our house. We have a particular community, the Jewish community, who live in a very isolated way. Nobody says anything about them. I have no problem with that. Hold on, I have no problem with that. If that's what they want to do, that's their choice. But we don't create a big fuss over the Jewish communities, especially that particular community living in that way.
Wait, you need to differentiate.
Why cause a fuss over a report that was made out of a hoax letter,
You acknowledge there are issues.
I did say at the beginning.
Rabbi Laura.
First of all, you're talking about faith schools. We're talking about state schools.
Yes,
That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Second thing...
There are many of the schools are funded by the state.
I'm not going to interrupt me. Stop. The second thing is what should be taught in schools. Actually, I think you should be teaching about religions. So that doesn't mean you have to believe. But if we don't know what other people believe, we won't know. The literacy to challenge the idea of what you mentioned, you used your language of the true faith.
But it's not just...
So I would say there are faiths out there, and Britain is about acknowledging truths of faith. And the third thing is about what you tolerate. The third thing is about what we tolerate. I don't think that everything goes, and I think that if there is incitement to hatred, to racial hatred, or gender hatred, or about sexuality, actually you do restrict that.
OK, but Douglas Murray... Don't worry, we've got a lot of time. Douglas Murray, you can't force people to believe things. You can't shoehorn people into a particular Douglas Murray-shaped, David Cameron-shaped Britishness.
No.
Can you? No,
I mean, this is part of... By the way, just very quickly, I mean, on this matter of this, I mean, I do think that one of the things...
But address that issue about...
OK, can I just mention first, one of the interesting things that's come up in recent days and weeks, I think, over this whole Trojan horse business, is I think that some Muslims in this country, particularly a lot of Muslim spokespeople, a lot of Muslim groups have been furious about these revelations and are now denying them. They're still denying them. And this is something like happened in the Catholic Church over the paedophilia scandal. People just don't want to admit it. They don't want dirty laundry to be aired in public. They genuinely think that... And that's why there's still this denial, even now. There's an official report by Sir Michael Wilshaw. It found some very disturbing things. Some people still think that they don't exist.
Is this the same Sir Michael Wilshaw who just did a U-turn on what Gov did or didn't tell him?
But Miriam, the thing... Either you think this has all been... Do you think this has all been made up? Do you think it's all been made up?
What I actually know is that there are serious governance issues, there have been internal administrative issues, whether there are issues of extremism, which is what you're peddling, and what in fact the publication you work for is peddling by publishing one of the worst covers in this country that I have ever seen, suggesting that young children are vehicles for extremism and terrorism. You should be ashamed to be even associated.
Daniel, can I just give, this is a very good example of the problem. Miriam, you are a very prominent spokesperson. You're a voice. You're a very prominent convert to Islam. You have a voice.
I don't call myself a convert.
Okay,
so don't call me one.
whatever it is you want to call yourself. You have a voice. here are some problems that are coming up, which have been exposed in schools, that seem to be teaching very seriously unpleasant things, and they're being taught by some extremist Muslims. Why, in this debate, you first of all deny that that is going on, and secondly, think the problem is a spectator cover cartoon.
I've never denied that there are issues.
I do not understand.
On these three,
the problem is not the spectator cover.
I think the
Let's
issue
go.
is you're
Miriam
trying
first. I want to speak to Daniel Hannan.
Yeah.
Miriam, respond to that.
You're trying to suggest what you're trying to do is support the Gove's agenda here, which is there are absolutely issues within these schools, and I think everyone, including the Hands Off Birmingham School campaign and others, have acknowledged that there are certain people who should even stand down as a consequence of some of the revelations in this report and reports that will come. The issue, however, is trying to rebrand this as an issue of extremism in order to expand this idea of extremism being non-violent ideas.
Or indeed Nick Griffin had been asked to come along and speak in a school.
Neither of the equivalents of those two individuals were invited to speak in these schools.
Well, I'm sorry, Shady Al-Sulaiman is a man who's called... What?
His views are worse than...
What are his views?
Well, anyone who supports Al-Qaeda in public, anyone who supports the ideology of Al-Qaeda...
Who says he supports
anyone
Al-Qaeda?
Who supports the
I'm not defending him, but who says...
People being stoned to death.
He should be invited to address...
Are you saying he's not as bad as Gert Wilders and Nick Griffin? Wait, one at a time.
I'm absolutely saying he should be invited to address schools.
You're saying he's not as bad as Gert Wilders or Nick Griffin?
I'm saying you can't compare the people who are speaking in these schools. I don't know about this particular
yes, he's worse.
speaker.
Mary, let me finish my point, please.
You can finish your point, but I'm saying to you, you have to
please
allow people to speak in this country.
Yeah, allow
me
to speak.
Egregious
Allow me
views.
to speak. Anyone who believes in stoning people to death, Nick Griffin has reprehensible views, but he doesn't believe that an adulteress should be stoned to death. Anyone who does should not be invited to a school. And nor should
does that include Jewish rabbis?
Let's have a question. And the next on the list is Daniel Hannan, and Adnan, I will come to you.
Maajid,
No, not yet, please.
Right, so
please, there's a lot of people, a lot of very interesting people to talk to.
If we can all agree that Nick Griffin should not be invited to speak to children...
Of course he shouldn't, and neither should this speaker, but nobody said he should.
Can I finish my point? And if we can agree there, then we should also, by implication, agree that anyone who believes in ideas far more reprehensible should not be invited to speak at schools. It's a moot point. It's just not something we should even be debating.
Yes, it's a platitude.
The fact that we're defensive about that is illustrative of the problem.
I'll come to you with a question.
Nobody's defensive about it.
No, Daniel Hannan is next. I want to bring it back. Peter Hitchens, thank you. I want to bring it back, and I think you've both, with huge respect, dealt with that particular issue, and we're going to park it for now. Daniel Hannan, MEP, freedom. We saw, of course, in recent European elections, a certain swing in a certain way and a huge discomfort across Europe about certain things that are happening. But this is the crux here, isn't it, in our debate about tolerating intolerance? Where do we draw that line? What is the definition of freedom? What is Britishness?
Well, you tolerate objectionable behaviour up to the point of incitement. You tolerate eccentricity up to the point of madness. You tolerate offensiveness up to the point of harassment. Toleration means you tolerate. It means you tolerate things that you find utterly appalling. What are British values? Well, you said at the beginning, Nikki, today is the 799th anniversary of the signing of Magna Carta. You could do a lot worse than the spare, terse inscription that appears on the Magna Carta memorial in Runnymede: freedom under law. If you wanted to distill British values into one phrase, and in that phrase is incorporated all the things that through the years made this country a better place to live than the authoritarian alternative. It implies regular elections, uncensored newspapers, equality between the sexes, jury trials, habeas corpus, free speech, free assembly, free conscience.
So where there is not equality between the sexes, and we have this segregation row, whether it's going on or not, in public places, and people's belief that there should be modesty and there should be some form of separation. We hear that from the authoritarian right-wing group Hizb ut-Tahrir. What should we do in that situation? How do we clamp down on it?
I agree with what Maajid said. You tolerate those views. Tolerating those views is not the same as teaching them in school.
Absolutely.
Every child born in this country, wherever his or her parents came from, is the heir to that same birthright that began with the Great Charter 800 years ago. And we cannot allow our own sons and daughters in this country, wherever their parents came from, to be denied their portion of our patrimony as a free society. That is something that should go without saying. Of course, people can have, once they've left school, they can have whatever eccentric opinions they want. but teaching people that they are not just a random collection of individuals born to a different random collection of individuals, but that they are British citizens, that we're bound together regardless of creed, regardless of race, that we have an identity as British subjects, and we're connected one to another. That is something that should go for all our children.
Liberalism with a small L. Yeah. OK, is that what... Peter Hitchens, in a minute, don't worry. I've got you all in mind. Peter Hitchens, is that something that we should fight for, the democratically achieved aspiration to and reality of liberalism?
It's fascinating the way all these British values merchants are so coy about the real basis of the liberty which we enjoy, which is the particular form of Protestant Christianity which this country adopted, which created in people the strength of conscience, the self-restraint, the belief very strongly that law should be above power because law derives ultimately from God. That is what actually makes this country what it is, but they won't talk about that because many of them are not Christians, many of them are active secularists, and many of them are nominal Christians, and they don't really believe these things. That's what made us what we are and made us the kind of country that we are. And to try and generalize this into some kind of human rights blancmange is to make a fundamental mistake about how it came about and what we would need to defend if we wished to preserve it. The interesting thing is I don't think a lot of the people, the loudest noises who go on about this, actually do particularly wish to preserve it, because many of them are allied with the principal political lobby which has undermined it most of all, which is the lobby which has been in favour of open borders, mass immigration and multiculturalism, which has made it so difficult to sustain this country as it was.
Ajmal and Miriam have just fallen out with you. They were with you.
Peter, what you just said
Wait, Daniel Hanna.
Being responsible for that is just false history. It is true that a measure of our individualist culture can be said to have a Protestant basis, and that's...
Why did you think I was aiming that at you?
No, I don't think it was aimed at me.
But it was, actually.
But when look at the phrase that appears in the Great Charter, the law of the land, not the King's law, not God's law, but a law that was immanent in the people and the territory. That was the genius of this country. That was our unique achievement, and that's been our greatest export, our supreme contribution to the happiness of mankind. The idea that the law is above the government, the biggest guy in the country doesn't get to tell other people what to do. He is bound by something bigger than him, and that is not a divine book. It's not a prelate or a prince. It's the law inherent in all of us as a common good.
Not a single person present at Runnymede 799 years ago today did not believe in the Christian God or believe that law derived from God.
That's nonsense.
I think there is
Nor do they believe in equality between men and women. Adnan's been waiting. Don't worry. We've got time. This is one debate in an entire hour. Adnan Rashid, I just wonder, should we not be really careful about what we teach our children, and we should be teaching all children, because we rise about this, the great literature of the, Romeo and Juliet, the great Shakespearean plays. Otherwise, they are kind of denuded and they're disconnected from the rest of our culture, and they need more cultural enrichment than just a sacred text. Do you not agree with that?
I agree with that 100%. We must teach our children how to live in this world. This is a very complex, multicultural world, and we live in it as a family. Like this is a perfect demonstration of a family. We are all a family. We disagree with each other.
We're a dysfunctional family.
Sometimes severely. I find some of the views here very objectionable. But Maajid Nawaz comes out, he's attacking Muslims for believing in things that the Jews believe in. There are Jewish rabbis who believe in exactly the same things that Sheikh who came to lecture in the school. And have you ever
what
seen...
aspect of the attack?
I want to ask Maajid, do you see anything wrong with the Jewish rabbis?
What?
Do you see anything wrong with them?
That's a Maajid?
Exactly.
Well, no. Let's hear his answer.
The point is...
That was a big question.
I think there's something...
Let's hear...
Okay,
wait, no. Let's hear it. You've got another question. Big answer.
Okay.
Maajid.
He doesn't see anything wrong with them. So the Jews can believe in the Torah.
Adnan,
what and there's a problem with the Muslims believing in the Quran.
What aspect... Hang on, wait. What aspect of Muslim belief did he decry?
Everything he picks on in the Muslim belief. Let me finish. Everything he picks on in the Muslim belief is believed by the Jews. The Jews believe in the Torah. And Torah has verses. I mean, they believe in the 5 books. I challenge Maajid to come out in public to condemn, to criticize the Jews for believing in things the Muslims believe in. He will never do that, because that will destroy his political career. He will be accused of anti-Semitism. I don't want him to do that. I defend the rights of the Jews to believe in what they want to believe in.
Maajid,
likewise, we as Muslims...
Wait, Laura, in a second. Laura, in a second. But just on this particular issue, I saw you on Newsnight. Wait. Yeah. I saw you on Newsnight the other night. Yeah. You were there with a gentleman called Ibrahim Hewitt, and and we've seen this on other occasions, he refused, he runs a faith school, but he refused to, and a lot of people do not understand the complexities of the ultimate aspirational Islamic State and Sharia law, would have been aghast at his refusal to condemn stoning. What's that all about?
I think I just understood what's going on. So, I think I've just got it.
Did you understand the question?
Yes, I think I've just understood.
I lost myself halfway through.
I think I've just understood what our friend here is on about. The Old Testament mentions stoning, and I condemned a chap on Newsnight for not condemning stoning women to death. Look, if you're an atheist, if you're Jewish, if you're Christian, if you're Muslim, if you're a horse, right, and you call for stoning women to death, I will challenge you and condemn you. I don't care what your religion is, frankly.
And I agree with it.
Wait, I'll tell you what.
I agree with him. You do not call people to stone a woman to death.
You asked him a question.
Not a Muslim on the planet calls for stoning a woman.
Wait, Adnan, why don't you ask... sorry, Maajid. Well, easily confused. Yeah. Maajid, why don't you ask Adnan the question... the key question here about stoning. Why don't you ask him?
Well, I mean, we can ask about stoning.
I'll ask him about that.
Yeah, so because, Adnan, I'm not sure what you're taking issue with, because you see, it sounds to me like...
My take is the Islamic take.
Ask the question.
OK, so if in a Islamic state, with the Sharia conditions all being perfect, in principle, I condemn stoning a woman to death.
OK.
Right? Do you, with Sharia conditions being present, in an Islamic state, condemn stoning women who are adulteresses to death?
Yes or no?
Can I... No, there is no yes or no answer. Can I ask him a question? Can I ask him a question? Can I ask him a question?
Why is there no yes?
Likewise, Maajid, can I talk to you?
Why is there no yes or no answer?
No. Nicky, can we get an answer? Because I answered his question. Okay. Can we now get an answer?
He misrepresents...
Do not let him get away with no answer. I answered his question.
Wait. Fair and fair between the two of us.
I want to know... Wait.
So you have to let me
Are you going to answer yes or no?
No, there's no yes or no answer to this question.
Rabbi Laura.
Okay, so
Rabbi Laura.
Found what you said extremely distasteful. And the tone, I haven't finished, the tone in which you said about the Jews, Jewish rabbis, the stoning, incredibly distasteful.
I didn't criticise anyone.
And I just said really
I defend the rights of the Jews. I defend the rights of the Jew to believe in what they want to believe.
That's great. Let Laura talk.
So we have to be consistent.
Adnan, please let Laura talk.
Sure.
And I really would find it very uncomfortable if you started defending me, because I would find that quite untrustworthy after what you've just said.
What did I say?
So, I'm finished.
Sure.
Anybody who uses text to defend violence, stoning, is wrong.
Right.
And if there is a school, a faith school or a state school, that is teaching it, I object to it, because I believe in the rule of the land. And I believe that schools are there to teach that they do need supervision, faith schools and non-faith schools.
So
the government shouldn't get rid of their responsibilities by handing these things over. And any violence from whoever, from whatever type of faith, and the faiths are not unitary in how they are, should be condemned.
OK, Tracy. Sorry I've waited so long before I've come to you. But you're in education. I believe you're an educational social worker.
I have in the past been in education,
in the past, so you understand this area. Surely it's this. It's not so much what people believe, it's the fact of imposing those beliefs on children who have not yet had the chance to make an informed decision.
Absolutely, and I think that's what makes it so difficult when you talk about things like asking people with extremist views into schools. If professional teachers are allowed to do their job properly, their job is around equipping young people to make informed choices about what's being said and about the speaker, about context, because actually if we don't teach about a multiplicity of faiths within schools and about a range of different value systems, and it's uncomfortable, that will involve them hearing things that I don't agree with, but if we don't teach and equip young people to make discerning judgments about those things that are being said, they're going to be badly let down in real life.
How do we equip them? What does that mean?
I think it's about allowing teachers to do their jobs properly. It was interesting when you were talking about the situation in Birmingham. I recall in a previous role I had going in and visiting a Catholic-run pupil referral unit, which was doing some really good things with young people from Catholic schools who were struggling within the education system. And what the leader of that centre said to me is, Part of why I can do what I do with these young people is because I can stand in front of them and say, as a Catholic, I believe those things. I believe those within a range of different things, but actually I believe that I'm utterly loved by God unconditionally. And as a Catholic, I can stand and say that in that context. And I think we've reached a point where in schools today, people are afraid to say that and fearful of saying that.
But I heard tell of one particular, so sorry to interrupt, but it's important to what, and I think it's relevant to what you're saying. I heard tell of one particular, a friend was telling me, one particular Catholic school, they were telling 5-year-olds about burning in hell.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you need to be Catholic, you don't need to be Christian, you just need to be a sentient human being.
This is not just an issue of extremist Muslims.
Absolutely not.
No, and I think that, I think that would be another point I would make. Why on earth, as Christians, we seem to think that this is something that's happening to other people, that it's only Muslim schools where these sorts of things can happen? Of course, there's a question of degree, but actually we have to turn the light on ourselves and say, as Christians, we have some pretty shady parts of our own past that we're not so willing to own up to around extremism and around views that people find unacceptable. I don't understand why we seem to dissociate ourselves from that. It's all about them out there. Actually, we all swim in the water and we all get wet. We've all done these things, and actually ill behoves any of us to be making judgments about that being the sole responsibility of the Muslim community have to sort out. We've done those things ourselves, and we need to be humble about that.
Daniel Hannan.
The single most disturbing thing I've heard this morning, in fact, really the only disturbing thing I've heard this morning, was how, in a conversation about who is and isn't allowed into secular schools, we suddenly got onto the Jews. How on earth did that happen? That's something which, travelling around the world, I've got in other countries, and it's not something I ever expected to hear in a conversation in this country on television. And I really do find that chilling. But I would just say one thing which I do strongly agree with, the point that we're not talking about a faith community. We're talking about bad behaviour by some individuals. I have been elected for 15 years. I have about 150,000 Muslim constituents. A number of them have got themselves elected to things. I have Muslim councillors, Muslim MPs. The new leader of the Conservative group in the European Parliament, Syed Kamal, is a fairly devout, believing
Fairly
Muslim.
devout?
Yeah, he tries to pray 5 times a day. He keeps the fast. He's done his Hajj.
Right.
You know, but being British, he's very diffident about it. He hates talking about his faith. But in a quiet way, he has done his best to live as a good Muslim. It makes him a better politician, and it makes him a more rounded human being. And the difference between him and Adnan is he's got himself elected to something. And I would say he is much more representative of the majority of British Muslims that I have in my constituency than people who make great television but who haven't taken the trouble to get a mandate in the ballot box for any of their opinions.
Ajmal Mansour.
I stood in the last parliamentary election, didn't win, became second. So I believe in the democratic process of all of our of the way to represent and put our interest first, the interest of the community first. The other day, as I was travelling, I heard a group of people talking behind me, those Muslims, the Muslims, these Muslims. So the new fashionable word, or this fashionable word, almost disgusting word, is that you can swear, attack the Muslims, almost it's the free house. But it's the culture that is becoming the problem. And also I remember Saeed Warsi not long ago was saying, that it's become fashionable to talk around dinner table against the Muslims. I'm hearing this is becoming worse day by day. I went to Birmingham the other day just to investigate at the back of the school what's really happening. I spoke to some parents, I spoke to some teachers and some pupils. And they all said we're scared of being Muslim any longer. And that's a terrible state of play. We don't want to do that any longer. What we want to do is, hold on, we want to create a society where we all feel respected, even if we disagree. So Islam has a contribution to make, and it has. If it wasn't for the Muslims translating the books of the Greeks into Latin, we would not see what we see today in the industrial world. So I think those recognitions need to be made in our history books. We need to create an inclusive society and not preach this hatred that's dominating our discourse currently.
Who's preaching hatred? Yeah, I agree. Wait a minute. But we had 400,000 Muslim soldiers who came and fought in this country for our values in the First World War, more in the Second World War. Young men who all came as volunteers, crossing half the world to take up arms for a country on which in most cases they'd never set eyes, because they believed that our values were better than the alternative. And they were right. They were fighting for a system that elevates the individual above the state, rather than exalting the state above the individual. Our values, yes. Yours and mine, because we both live in this country.
Collective values, right? But neoconservative value that we have just heard from Michael Gove, it actually excludes everybody else.
No,
listen for a second. In his book, Celsius 7:7, he identifies Islam as the poisonous, pernicious religion that needs to be fought at all costs.
Islamism,
No, hold on. However you want to call it, we know his agenda.
Hang on.
Please,
You've
please.
just made this elision between Islam and terrorism, which is what...
That's exactly what Michael Gove is doing. And currently, that's the debate we're having. The British value that we're talking about, we need to talk about British value with a bigger agenda, and that is, how can we create an inclusive society where Muslims, the Jewish communities, the Hindus, Sikhs, people of faith and no faith have a stake in this one
and we've been pretty good at that over the years. We've done that better than almost any other country in the world.
Quick
Back 100 years,
okay, we should do better.
Gentlemen, let's hear from your constituents. Let's hear, because you stood as a Liberal Democrat, didn't you? Let's hear from, you like democracy, you're all for it. Let's hear from,
everybody, please, go ahead.
Well, I don't know, Adnan.
No, come on.
Gentleman at the back, go on.
Basically,
quick points,
to be British is an idea of freedom that united our country, united the Commonwealth, united the English people, and it's enshrined in John Stuart Mill. Everyone has the right to practice their happy life, but when it takes away the freedom to other people to practice their happy life, that's why the British state has to be really strong in mediating boundaries. I defend everyone's right to practice their religion in any interpretation they choose, even if that's an extreme interpretation, but they don't have the right to stop a citizen criticising religions, writing thoughtful books, making films. The British state has to be really strong in defining the boundaries.
That's a really
good definition.
Yeah,
you can
thank you very much indeed.
As long as you don't encroach on
And I want to come on to that in a second, because it leads us nicely into another thing I want to talk about. Let's just hear from this lady first of all, though. Good morning.
Okay. I'd just like to say thank you to Peter for making the comment of a spiritual desert. We are sitting here right now in Brighton, reputedly being the most godless city in England. We have one of the highest
most godless city?
Yeah, in England, apart from Barnsley. We have one of the highest rates... This is important, what I'm going to say. We have one of the highest rates of young people's suicide. Also.
Is that because it's godless?
I don't know. I'm just telling you some facts, because you mentioned the word allegedly.
Yeah.
And if we're debating allegedly, we ought to look where our feet are right now. Because when two people in a family are having a row, the children suffer. And when two neighbours are having a row, the street suffers. And when the street is having a row, the whole community suffers. And what we are looking at is an elephant in the room. If we keep focusing and talking about Muslims in Birmingham, we are missing the point that children on our own doorsteps are dying, are suffering from mental illness, and it is poverty that's at the root cause of this.
Okay.
And I know the media are looking to sell more newspapers, and how exciting is it to keep commenting on what one person has said that's going to be talking about something that everybody disagrees with.
Godless city, Kevin Fry, that very quickly. This is something we do cover a lot. But
I wouldn't have the faintest idea whether Brighton was a godless city or wasn't a godless city. What I would be interested in is how do the people in Brighton relate to each other. My experience of visiting Brighton fairly regularly, because I live on the south coast, is it's a great place to visit. I love the warmth of the reception I get here. I love the interaction I have with people. I haven't the foggiest whether they're Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Jains, whatever, atheists, I just wouldn't know. It's just irrelevant. Yeah. There's something fundamental in here, and we've seen there's a parallel process here in the argument that's going on here, because the question today is, should we be tolerant of intolerance? And I doubt if anybody would hold their hand up and say, yes, generally we should be tolerant of intolerance. We shouldn't, but there's certain levels that we shouldn't go beyond. There's the law of the land. But we set levels as well that we say, cultural levels, that we say, culturally, we won't go beyond that. We don't need a law. We don't need a good book. We don't need a priest or a priestess to tell us.
Listen, on this, allow me to do this. I'll bring you in.
I'm prepared to say that we should tolerate intolerance. I believe that freedom of speech and thought are so valuable that we should defend them at all costs against all enemies. And that if you can't defend the freedom of speech and thought of people with whom you profoundly disagree, then it is no freedom.
But this debate splits into two.
There's a very important point about all this use of the word extremism in this discussion of these schools. We're constantly told that they are practicing extremism, and the suggestion is then made that this extremism will lead on to the commission of terrorist acts by people who've been taught extremism. This seems to me to be very dangerous for freedom of thought and speech. Many of the ideas which I hold, which frankly when my parents held them were commonplace in this country, but when I hold them are now deemed to be eccentric and outrageous by a lot of people, are increasingly classified as extremism by the mainstream. How long is it before the classification of somebody's ideas as extremism
But can we ask you?
how long is it before this, let me finish the point, if I may, I'm clearly about to finish it, so if you interrupt me now, you stop me doing so. How long is it before the classification of such ideas as extremism leads to restrictions on freedom of speech? I don't think it's very long. I think we should be very careful about the way in which we approach these things. I disagree immensely with a lot of what Muslims think and say. I think that there are many disputes which I have with them, many criticisms I have of their faith, but I think they should be free to express them, not least so that we can know what they are.
Okay, Andrea. Yes. We speak at last. You believe there's an issue, don't you, across the world? Because quite a lot of people come to this country because it is a tolerant country, and yet I know you feel that when Christians go abroad, they're very often persecuted, aren't they? Or when Christians who live abroad.
Well, indeed, that they are persecuted, and we've seen whether in secular regimes, hard secular regimes, very often Christians are not free to practice their beliefs. In hard Islamic regimes, Christians aren't free to practice their beliefs, or secularists aren't free to go about their way. So I think we do have to look at the root of why our country has been known as the land of the free and the brave, a country where our education systems, our parliamentary systems have been emulated across the world. Why? It goes right back to the Magna Carta, that's true. But the inspiration behind the Magna Carta was Jesus Christ. The inspiration was Christianity. And actually, that is what has given us our freedom and our flourishing. And the reality now is, as we experience social, cultural chaos and a deep sense of lostness in terms of our identity, that we get this kind of collision of ideas, suppression and oppression. The reality of Christianity is that it is welcoming, it is hospitable, it doesn't coerce, it hosts. And what we're finding with an increasingly secular regime, and certainly what I'm finding as director of the Christian Legal Centre, is that Christians are losing their jobs for offering prayer, Christians are losing their jobs for holding opinions in schools, Christians are losing their jobs because they won't preside over same-sex marriages. There is a and this is reality. I think another thing I want to just say as well, a reality of working at the Christian Legal Centre is this, that in the last month we've had women who have been born and raised in London and in London schools and at London universities who have wanted to leave Islam, and they have been threatened with their life if they leave Islam. Now, these women aren't coming from Saudi Arabia, they're not coming from northern Nigeria. Sadly, they're coming from London, they're coming from Birmingham, they're coming from Bradford. And that's when we can't tolerate such intolerance. We can't tolerate the threat of women. But this is something that this is something that is real.
Miriam. Okay, thank you, Andrea. That's a thing we need to.
I think this debate on tolerance, it must split into two.
What about that? Do you believe that's happening? People threatened.
It does happen.
How do you know it happens?
Well, I've been approached by people who've told me they've been threatened and intimidated. I know it happens, and I come from that community.
It happens abroad. It's legally.
It happens here. I come from that community.
Statutory in some other parts of the world.
Yes, but I think this debate splits into two. And then we're mixing the two things up. Legal tolerance of bigotry exists in this country for good reason, because we need to hear extremist views and vent them out in a democratic process. But in civil society, it doesn't mean that we promote, teach, endorse racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, such as what we've heard on this show today, or any other form of bigotry, whether it's justified by God or any other form of ideology. I think that's the distinction. Yes, and anti-Muslim hatred. Yeah. That's the distinction we have to make.
So shall we ban the Torah?
And legal tolerance.
Shall we ban the Torah?
No, we should ban anyone.
My question. Legal Can we start by banning the Torah?
No.
Why would
why not? Miriam, wait. This seems to be obsessed with the Jews.
No, I'm not. I'm pointing out. Your inconsistency.
Let me throw it. Okay, Rabbi Laura, then Miriam. I want to see from some women.
I just don't want to be distracted by the anti-Semitism, which is.
There is no anti-Semitism here. I'm sorry. Do not blur the debate by accusations.
Rabbi Laura, let me ask you another question, which will take us in another direction.
I think it's really unfair that I'm not given the chance to speak.
Miriam, you had plenty of chance to speak.
Okay, so can I speak after the rabbi?
Miriam was speaking just a minute. Allow me to go to the rabbi, because allow me to just take a turn in the debate. And then, Miriam, you can respond to that. That'd be lovely, wouldn't it?
Oh, so lovely. Yes, please.
Now, is it the duty of faith leaders to encourage people of faith to see their faiths in a modern context.
Yes, and what does modern mean? That means with
Contemporary
doubt.
British, or...?
Yes. I think it means with doubt. I think that doubt is a great inoculation against fundamentalism. And we should question and we should learn about ourselves, about other faiths. So yes, it is our roles as faith leaders to teach in a modern way, and that means about ourselves and about other religions with questions.
No absolute certainty.
No, I'm absolutely sure about that.
Miriam, what about that? What about people standing up and actually saying, because I know there's a great sense of solidarity within faiths, within communities, and if one is attacked, there's a feeling that everyone's being attacked, even if you don't necessarily agree with the person who's being attacked. Do you understand where I'm going with this? Isn't it time to stand up and actually, you know, condemn more when we hear outrageous things from people?
I don't know where you're going with that at all, and I'm going to choose to pretend that I don't know where you're going with that.
Well, Rabbi Laura kind of addressed it, didn't she?
Yes. I would like to come back to this idea that for me, faith leaders should teach what they think is right, and that's what they should teach. And schools should teach critical faculties which allow us to distinguish, you know, between solid arguments and unsubstantiated arguments. And that's it. Those are the divisions. Those are the lines.
And that's the extremism. That when we talk about extremism...
What's extremism?
Extremism is saying this is what you must think and this is the truth.
What I'm trying to say is, should faith leaders stand up and say this is not what you must think?
No,
we have to have some...
I agree completely with the rabbi.
Philosophical flexibility.
Absolutely. What we should be teaching, and this goes back to Gove.
Kevin first, then Miriam.
This goes back to Gove. What we should be teaching our children is how to think. The greatest gift you give a child is the skill to think, the critical function is to think. When you tell a child, this is what you must think. When Gove says, you must read this book and you can't read that book.
Andrew, you said you...
Gove said you can't read that book. This is almost as obsessive as it's all about the Jews. It's not all about Gove. It's not all about you. There is a curriculum where we encourage people to read the best literature in our language and in other languages.
One of the things that David Cameron
OK, Andrew Williams, you say that we have to believe in something.
Well, we can't teach and avoid. And actually what's given us our freedom and our flourishing is our Christian heritage, is the backdrop of our Christian faith. To believe in nothing, to believe in nothing, to believe in existentialism, to believe in freedom. Yes, and those ideals come from a Christian backdrop.
But ancient Greeks believed in democracy.
That's what served our... That's actually...
There has to be some moral absolutes. For example, when I'm teaching my children, do this and don't do that, I have to tell them this is wrong, this is right, but the my reasons for right and wrong are these. Yep. So we give them absolutes, as I think, and I also give them rationale. Without giving the kids absolutes, they'll be very confused. I believe, and this is an experience I've had with my eldest daughter, she's 8 now, 8 years of teaching children has made me more convinced that there are more needs for absolutes. Secondly, if the society didn't have absolutes, we'd all be doing all sorts of things without coming together on a plane that would govern us and create a cohesive society.
But as a faith leader, is it your duty, sorry to go back to this,
that's okay,
to bring beliefs up to date, or...
Contemporary interpretation of your text, as far as I'm concerned, as a Muslim, is a must. Yes. I can't not... it's wrong of me not to. The concept of ijtihad, which is a very fundamental principle of Islam, and that is to constantly renew the verdict that's been given to make it more relevant to the world in which you live, 21st century.
But not to the extent that you would say equal marriage is okay. You would stick to ancient beliefs on that.
There are certain principles of faith. For example, if somebody says, can you please abolish prayers? Can you please end fasting in the month of Ramadan because it falls in the longer days in June? Can we take it to December when it's shorter? We can't do those changes because these are absolutes in the Quran, and that's what makes Islam distinctly Islamic. If you take them away, you might as well not have Islam. So I'm saying contemporary interpretation would imply, how do I practice my faith? For example, in Norway, where the sun doesn't set...
So what about equal marriage? Would that be something you say that's an absolute?
As far as I'm concerned, Islam doesn't accept that. And those who do, we must allow both the sides to remain to their views. I can't change anyone's view. I believe in one, somebody else believes in something different.
Nawaz.
Yeah, and that in itself creates the level playing field in which we tolerate.
Maajid Nawaz.
And that's that good reason why the state is secular. because he's got the right to say that, and the state will conduct equal marriage. It will conduct marriage between a man and a woman and a woman, and it will not listen to that unless he wants to do it in his home. He can follow that view. But the state is not obliged to take any religious side on this, and that's called equality before the law.
And Douglas, we haven't heard from you for a while. Peter, in a second. Douglas first.
Let's say a couple of things. First of all, I mean, I always think it's useful. The former Bishop of Edinburgh, Richard Holloway, had a very good line on this. He said that the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. And I think it's worth bearing in mind. Look, I just wanted to mention also, comes back slightly to something I said earlier, but the period we are in of churn and rethinking about what it exactly is what the Prime Minister's been writing about this morning. Everyone's trying to nail these values down.
Nailing jelly to a wall.
And one of the things about this is, and I think it's just the reaction to Andrea's comments, a good example of that. Nobody, it seems, is very keen on admitting where, I mean, I speak as a secularist, but nobody's very keen on admitting the Christian origin of some of these things, and I think we have to be frank about that. We can't write our heritage out or pretend it was something else. And just very quickly, one of the things that is being done on this, which has come up several times this morning, is this attempt to sort of encompass everybody in the new values. I mean, sometimes, you know, it's all freedom, good, openness, great tolerance, yes. It's all fine. There is a risk, however, in this, and it comes back to the thing about always highlighting gay marriage and other things, again, something I'm supportive of. But there is a risk in this that we build up this new value system on extremely wide ground, because it's ground we want to be as wide as possible to encompass everyone, but it might also be ground that's very shallow. And I would suggest that some of the things we're talking about, if you identify your country solely on some of the lines we're discussing at the moment, it could yet prove to be, and this comes back to the point the lady in the back made, it could prove to be too shallow for some people, and I think that's something we have to think about.
Well, Peter, you say in your column today, this whole thing about... Well, OK, the gentleman now wants to say something, then I'll come to you, Peter. You're very insistent, so let me just bring the microphone. Oh, very quick, we'll run out of time.
I'm a 91-year-old gay man, following what these gentlemen have said. I'm living in a relatively friendly gay city of Brighton. I'm in an 18-year-long loving relationship with my partner. I campaign to combat homophobia. I used to say to people, please understand. I've been married, had 3 children, I've got 3 grandchildren, but I've always been gay. People have said to me, you can't possibly be gay. I didn't choose to be, I am gay. Now, I stopped asking people to understand because I don't understand myself. So I now say to people, please accept homosexuality.
Fine. A fine oration, sir, and it's lovely to have you in the studio. Peter, you say in your column today, you described this, I mean, I said nailing jelly to a wall, this finding a definition of Britishness. You described it as squelchy. You know, it's impossible to define. What is Britishness to you?
It is impossible to define. You can only define it by the way in which it's been destroyed.
So what does Mr. Cameron mean? What's he talking about?
He doesn't know what he means. He's simply talking for political advantage. The difficulty that these people have is that the nation-state, which I very much support, is the largest unit in which it's possible to be effectively unselfish. We had that. Now that we don't necessarily share either a religion or a language or a belief in certain customs and laws, we don't have it. It's a regrettable change that's overtaken this country, but one which is obviously irreversible. How we work out how to live with our new neighbours in peace and harmony is going to be very difficult. I don't think it's going to be British. I think we've lost that. It's going to be something else. We can mourn its loss, but to pretend that we can recreate it by speeches...
I think British values are actually remarkably easy to define. They reside in the elevation of the individual above the state and the elevation of the law above the government. In other words, in constitutional freedom. Now, you might say, oh, but those are universal values, though, or at least they're Western values. No. How did they become universal values, right? Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There'd have been nothing universal about them then. These were values overwhelmingly developed in the language that you and I are now talking. And they were exported, through... if we're honest about it, through a series of military victories by the English-speaking peoples, and thank God they were. Imagine if those conflicts of the last 100 years had ended differently, and we were living in a system that elevated the state over the individual. There was nothing universal about
it. There are 2 ways to say British values. You can say British, you're out, or British with warmth. So let's say British values is a warm thing based on universal values, and therefore it's expansive.
Miriam, you agree with that? British values. Squelchy or quite clear? Squelchy, Peter. Quite clear, Daniel. I don't mean that personally.
No, I think where Peter's right is that there is, and it's been expressed by others, but there is obviously a debt to Christianity in this country, and there's no reason to pretend that there isn't. Why wouldn't we acknowledge that? It's part of the history. But there's also, you know, a debt to other trends and ideas, and acknowledging that is part of recognising that what it meant to be British in Peter's parents' generation is not what it means to be British today.
Okay.
And to be inclusive means acknowledging the new voices in that discussion, in the redefinition of what it means to be British.
Adnan, Britishness. What's it all about?
I'm a proud Muslim. I'm proud to be British. I love being in Britain. It's a tolerant society. The British people are very tolerant and loving people. I want to keep it that way. And what's happening right now is that some bigoted politicians are making look this country ugly. It's a beautiful country. It must remain so. And I defend the freedom of every single individual who lives here according to the law. Thank you very much.
The final word.
Ajmal, last word, I think.
To me, Britain has given me what it should have given me. To me, Britain is more Islamic than most Muslim countries. And that in itself says a lot to me. It's where I can be who I am. I can be free to express myself. I can have my children grow. I can be proud of my neighbours. I can be proud of everything. But do you know what? Some of these values are universal, and I want to be a proud citizen of the world where these values are practiced by everybody.
OK, well, I think we are going to get one last word, and that's going to be from
I just want to say,
30 seconds.
It's a feeling, and we love being here, and that feeling is what we need to promote. So everyone wants to make this country better and safer and more secure going forward for our future generations. It doesn't have to be
I want to end it there because we're ending on harmony. Before we all go to lunch together. Believe that, you'll believe anything. As our debate continues on Twitter online, end of the series. We're back next year, January the 11th. Until then, have a great summer. Goodbye from everybody here in Brighton.